Alright, Jeep, so we're back, of course, to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake. So usually when it comes to our discussions for Remake and like the future of Remake, the project and stuff, we're normally talking about specifically Part 2. And usually the discussion falls in line with like anywhere from outside of Midgar all the way to at least the end of Disc 1. But for today's video, we're going a little bit further into the future because we're talking about something that takes place on Disc 2 of the original game. And we're, of course, talking about acquiring the Submarine, which is one of the few vehicles that you get in the original FF7. You get, like, the car for a while, the buggy. Then you eventually get the Tiny Bronco, which is a crashed plane that can go around in shallow waters. Then eventually the Submarine. And then eventually, of course, the Highwind. The Submarine, however, is a pretty unique vehicle within the Final Fantasy series, at least for the games that I've played. Now, I've played most of the games in the series, but I haven't played every game to completion, so I can't vouch if other games have had a Submarine-like vehicle. Like 8, for example, had a buggy as well, but also had one of the gardens. I can't remember which garden. I think it was Blom Garden. Could like drive on the water a little bit, and then eventually you got an airship, of course. And most Final Fantasy games have an airship, but even the Final Fantasy games that have had a like water vehicle that I've played, at least, you couldn't go underwater and actually explore the bottom of the ocean. The question we're asking today, and it might seem like it has an obvious answer potentially, but it's an important question, is whether or not we're going to see the Submarine when it comes to Final Fantasy VII. Why it might seem like it has an obvious answer is because if we're following the same story from Final Fantasy VII within Remake, which is what we're told, right? We're told we're getting roughly the same story from the original game. We eventually have to go to the bottom of the ocean in order to get the Key of the Ancients. Obviously, spoilers here if you've not played the original FF7, but you eventually need to get the Key to the Ancients underwater with the Submarine to unlock like the machines in the Forgotten Capital to progress the story. It's kind of a TLDR on it. This is why it might seem like a pretty obvious answer to this question, because if you're somebody that's of the belief that we're getting the exact same story going forward, then this is an obvious answer. It's like, yeah, of course. Eventually, we're going to have to go to the bottom of the ocean, so of course we're getting the Submarine at some point. I'm not of that belief. Now, I'm not saying the story is not going to play out in a similar fashion, but I don't think we're going to get like this beat-for-beat similar story, which some people seem to think, just because like one of the devs said that we're getting the FF7 story that we know, that people take that as like, it's going to be the exact fucking same, and I just don't think it will be. And here's why I think it could potentially be different when it comes to Remake, is because in my kind of brief research for this video, I can't really find an answer or a reason as to why the key needed to be underwater. Like is there a reason for that? Maybe there's like an Ultimania that explains it somewhere or some shit. Outside of there actually being a lore explanation and reason for the key to be underwater, we could always just find the key in a different way. Like, it could just, there's no reason it couldn't just be in a cave somewhere, right? In a cave near the Forgotten Capital, maybe we come back to the Forgotten Capital, there's a cave there that we didn't know was there, didn't explore when we first get there, something like that. Go in there, get the key, come back, some shit like that. Because everything else underneath the ocean is entirely optional. You get the Submarine, you go get the key, go back to Forgotten Capital. But everything else, Emerald Weapon, the Sunken Gelnica, the cave you can take Vincent to see Lucretia, stuff like that. Like, it's all entirely optional stuff you do not have to do. And this is sort of the main reason why I could see them changing it, because nothing that is underneath the ocean is mandatory outside of the Key of the Ancients. Now, when I say I think they could change it, or I expect them to change it, I'm not saying that I want that. By no means do I want that. I of course want the Submarine and be able to explore the bottom of the ocean, Sunken Gelnica, all that shit, fighting Emerald Weapon underwater, even though that doesn't actually make a lot of sense. Side note, I did a video on that a couple years back about like the whole fight with Emerald Weapon, how it doesn't really make a lot of sense because our characters are standing at the bottom of the ocean to fight him. Like, obviously that doesn't logically make sense. If our characters can survive the bottom of the ocean just standing down there, why do we even need a submarine in the first place? Just stuff like that. If we look at the Emerald Weapon fight from like a logical perspective, people hated that video. I still get comments on it to this day. But even the optional stuff aside, when we're talking about Remake going forward, if they're going to add an underwater section, it's going to have to be way bigger than it was in the original game, because obviously Remake is a more realistic version of the world of Gaia and Midgar and stuff like that. That's why Midgar is so massive, even though we didn't get to fully explore that. Because if you're comparing to the original game, the problem with the original game's submarine stuff, I know it's a game from like 20-something years ago, but you could dive anywhere, but you always ended up in the same basic area. Like the same relatively small area. It's not like super small, but no matter where you dived at in the world map, you'd end up in the same area with Emerald Weapon and all that other Sunken Gelnica, everything like that. And that would be like a weird suspension of disbelief when it comes to Remake, given that Remake has such a realistic take on the world. So if they're going to add this when it comes to the Remake like games, they would almost have to make an entire underwater section for pretty much the entire world map, unless they just don't care about people's like suspension of disbelief and they don't give a shit that no matter where you dive at, you end up in the same area, which they could do as well. I'm not entirely against that, but part of me would also like to be able to explore a lot of the ocean, have a lot of things to find underwater, besides just the couple of things that were there in the original game. I mean, we're talking about the entire ocean. The ocean that covers the entire goddamn planet. There's not 3 items or something in the ocean alone. Like, I know it's a video game. I know there's limits, but man, you gotta add some more stuff to it if you're gonna do it at all. But going back to the Midgar example, we have this fantastic modern interpretation of Midgar, what it would look like if it was a real location, but we also didn't get to explore all Midgar, and that's the same route they could go with the underwater. Maybe what they could do, instead of allowing you to dive anywhere, is maybe there's only certain locations around the world map, assuming that we have free roam with the submarine once we get the submarine. Maybe you can only dive in certain locations. Maybe there's dark... Think, it's going to be a weird example, but fuck it, let's pull it out. Let's Gen 3 Pokemon. Fucking Sapphire, Ruby, Emerald. There was dive locations, dark circles in the water. That's where you could dive at. Think something along those lines. It's a bit of a weird comparison, but it makes a lot of sense, and it's the best comparison I can come up with, because you could hit these dive spots, go down there, there'd be unique locations with unique Pokemon you could run into, and then they would lead sometimes to caves and things that had like treasure and items and all that other shit. And they could do the same thing here with Remake. If they made it to where you couldn't dive anywhere, I would rather there be like a set amount of locations around the world map within the ocean. I don't know how many there could be. There were unique locations when you dove down there, and they would lead to like maybe random enemies, unique enemies, maybe unique bosses, secret bosses, unique and rare items, rare material, things like that. Like, that'd be so much more interesting than if you dive anywhere, you end up in the same fucking area. I think we can all agree on that. I just personally feel like having a set amount of locations instead of what we just discussed is the best middle ground and compromise, instead of them trying to create an entire underwater ocean for us to explore. That just doesn't seem that realistic. Because assuming that we eventually do get the high wind, the airship, the ability to like drive around the whole map, assuming that we get that, then if you could then land the airship somewhere, get in your submarine, go to like this random part of the ocean, dive down, and then it's the same area if you went to the other side of the fucking planet and did the same thing. Like, honestly, that'd be like super underwhelming from like the player's perspective, right? And I think the devs themselves wouldn't want to do that, which is why I think limited amount of areas would make the most sense. Now, I'm trying to look at this from like kind of a logical perspective, if that makes any sense. But that being said, if the devs themselves want to go through that effort, and eventually, once we get the ability to have an airship and explore the world, if they want to go through the effort of making this giant underwater, like explorable area that's pretty much its own other world map, dude, I'm all for that shit, of course. That's what I want more than the other thing. Look, my dudes, I know this is super far to the future in terms of when this is actually going to happen for us, but I've just been writing down a lot of video ideas lately, and I want to switch it up, because we've mostly been talking about, like, Disc 1 stuff, Part 2 related stuff, and I just want to do something a little bit different for today's video. So, of course, pass off to you guys, assuming that you've played the original FF7, I guess you don't actually have to play it, I kind of explain what the submarine stuff is. What do you think they're going to do when it comes to the remake games once we get to that point? Once we get to probably the third game or so, once we potentially get the ability to use the submarine, if that's in the story as well, do you think they're actually going to add the submarine to the game at all, I guess, technically? But also, if they have the submarine, do you think we're actually going to be able to dive down and explore this massive underwater area? Or do you think it's going to be a relatively smaller, contained area, no matter where you dive at, you just kind of come to the exact same area, similar to the original FF7? Leave your thoughts and more in the comment section below. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Once I did more Final Fantasy VII Remake content, turn on my notifications, follow me on Twitter, @DavidYT, and my Discord. Links to my soundbox are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Logain, or leave it like Cobain.